Welcome to Outcast, the podcast where we hear coming out stories from famous faces and brilliant LGBTQ+ people working hard behind the scenes, from all backgrounds and from all corners of the globe. On this podcast, we discover life stories, and in doing so, we dissect some of the most pressing issues faced by the LGBTQ+ community today. We hope we can support and inspire you, our listeners, whether you're part of the LGBTQ+ community, out or not, or an ally listening to learn more. I'm Rosie Pentreath, your host, and I've shared my coming out story in writing and on various panels, and I know firsthand the value of talking through my experiences. Now I'm giving people from all corners of life and from all backgrounds the same opportunity. You may have listened to other episodes before, and if you have, thank you for coming back. Or you may be here for the first time because of our guest. Welcome. You can follow us on social media at OutcastLGBT, and you can find us online at outcastpod.com. Thank you for listening. Today, I'm meeting opera singer, composer, playwright, and educator Deborah Cheetham Fraillon. Deborah has been a leader and a pioneer in the Australian arts landscape for more than 25 years, and this intersects with her being an LGBTQ+ advocate. In 2009, she established Short Black Opera as a national not-for-profit opera company devoted to the development of indigenous singers, and she's performed all over the world. In the 2014 Queen's Birthday Honours list, Deborah was appointed as an Officer of the Order of Australia for distinguished service to the performing arts as an opera singer, composer, and artistic director to the development of Indigenous artists and to innovation in performance. A proud Yorta Yorta woman, she is a member of the stolen generation of Indigenous Australians, and her experience of coming out as a lesbian intersects with her experience of that deeply traumatic policy, as well as her experience of growing up with a white Baptist family. She performed at Live and Proud Sydney World Pride opening concert and other World Pride events, including Black and Deadly at the Sydney Opera House in 2023, and she's just stepped into the role of Elizabeth Todd Chair of Vocal Studies at Sydney Conservatorium of Music. Deborah, you describe yourself as a 21st century urban woman who's Yorta Yorta by birth, stolen generation by government policy, soprano by diligence, composer by necessity, and lesbian by practice.
Yes, I decided that had to be my bio, because you get to a certain point, and everybody will arrive at this point, different times in their life. But I got to a certain point where it was my least favorite thing to do, updating the bio. What things needed to stay in, what things were the most significant, what do I leave out? And I felt like I needed to distill the information about me down to these critical points. And at the time, I remember it was the occasion of the Peggy Glanville Hicks oration. And I was giving this oration. And finally, I'd got to the point where I felt I had to just narrow it down to these critical points. And I said to Genevieve Lacey, who was introducing me, and this is what it is. And she was totally comfortable with that. And she said, lesbian by practice, hey? And I said, absolutely. I'm a career lesbian and it's been the practice of a lifetime. I hope that I'm quite good at it now. But I wanted to put that there because I really felt that even now, even the 21st century, there are still places, certainly many places in the world, but there are still places in Australia where you will be persecuted on the basis of your sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to put that right out there and say, okay, you need to know this about me. If you're overlooking it, or you prefer to define me by, whatever is important to you, know what is important to me. And that's why I put it last in that list.
Yeah, I really love that. You've got a certain position in society and you're well known, it has a power of saying it for that reason. But I also like that you say it because that's what's important to you.
Absolutely. I've seen enough of the world through the eyes of my students. You know, I've been a teacher for a very long time. It's perhaps something that people don't know about me, that I started life as actually as a secondary my career as a secondary school music teacher. You know, that was back in the late 80s, and across my career as a teacher, there have been many eventful moments, but the things that stand out to me are the students who've, you know, in later years contacted me and told me of their struggles when at school, when they felt they weren't being accepted, and how it helped them to know that there was a teacher who had navigated life successfully. I mean, it wasn't always smooth, and some of those
Mm.
some of those journeys through the private school system of New South Wales have had their impact. But what's important is, if you do have a voice that is being heard at a certain time,
Mm.
then you need to represent. It's really important to represent and never think that the struggle is over. It's always new for someone. It's always someone's first time to come out to their parents. You know, the universal acceptance of the queer community is a ways off. So we need to represent.
Yeah, and we all get so used to being out, but you're right. Being out and coming out is so new for someone right now, and then tomorrow, and then the next day, etc.
Many in our community are only too aware of that and doing everything they can and to raise awareness and build support networks and make sure that people do not feel alone or isolated in their journey to connect with their own identity. For me, I think those years as a teacher and remaining connected to, you know, generations that are younger than myself, uh, there are all sorts of incredible benefits to that. Uh, I think it keeps you young. It forces you to stay relevant if you possibly can keep up. But for me, it also was a constant reminder that the struggles that I faced, someone else is facing those now. And if I can say, look, here I am, albeit there are a number of scars that I've accumulated along the way, but here I am. And I see you.
Yeah, absolutely. As a side note, I love that you were with Jen Lacey when you kind of came up with that description. So I've got the privilege of working with her on a project at the moment, and she's just wonderful. Anyway, that's a side note.
Yeah. She's an exceptional human being, incredible musician.
Yeah, she's amazing. So let's go back to where you got those scars from before you got those scars potentially. Can you take me back to when you first came out or first started to come out? Obviously, there's not always just one coming out. It's not a moment that we shed and then just move on from.
Oh, for sure. You're so right there, Rosie. Coming out is a lifelong process. It does get much easier, but it never actually goes away, because there is always the assumption that the central society is white heterosexual
Mhm.
society, and that everybody else orbits around that. So I had many different kinds of coming out as a Yorta Yorta woman, coming out as an opera singer, coming out as a lesbian. Um, I've always known that I was attracted to women, and long before I had even encountered the term lesbian, I was growing up with my adopted family. They were very strict Baptists. I don't think there's any other kind of Baptist, only strict ones.
Mhm.
So the idea of any kind of sexuality outside of the heteronormal and not even very interesting, can I say? Look, apologies to Baptists who will be listening to this, but you've got to understand, I grew up in the Baptist church. in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So it might be different today. I don't know. I'm no longer a member of the Baptist church, but back then, yeah, it was pretty strict. It just was not talked about or explored or explained to me, but I knew from a very early age that I was attracted to women and only to women. In my teenage years, I, had a couple of boyfriends that were not so much about a real, an intense attraction, but being like minded in some way. For instance, I used to ride a motorbike, and there was one other boy at the neighbouring school who had a motorbike. We were both in a musical together, Fiddler on the Roof it was. And he had a motorbike, I had a motorbike. And so it just seemed natural that we should, get
Hang
together.
out.
He was a really lovely guy, but I knew then I couldn't offer him what he was looking for. It wasn't what I was interested in. I went to an all-girls school. I'd had several great crushes and one particular love that was unrequited. But I knew that I this is what I wanted. I didn't know how I would go about that because I was still living in that very cloistered and closeted community. Their closet, not mine. I came out. I guess I was outed actually. My first real girlfriend and I went on a trip to northern New South Wales, and a couple from the church that I still belonged to at that stage, they got wind that I was travelling northern New South Wales, and they were too, and they said, "Come and stay with us."
Oh no.
Oh, what could possibly go wrong? So, they said, "Oh, we've only got one bed. You don't mind sharing with your girlfriend," in inverted commas. I says, "No, not at all."
How did you know?
And yeah, basically they caught us in the act. So that didn't go down well, let's just say, in this church that I'd grown up in my whole life. Uh, I held several positions of responsibility within the church, and that was all stripped away.
Mm.
It took me, Rosie, it took me a long time to recover from that. That early trauma was one that just struck at the heart of my identity. I'd pieced together this identity. In fact, I wrote a play about it, White Baptist ABBA fan. And that play, which toured from about 1995, was all about this identity that I'd pieced together for myself, adopted. I hadn't realized I was stolen generation. Um, a Baptist, I hadn't figured out how to be a lesbian or how that would play out. All this transition from one identity that I pieced together that just did not fit me at all. It's like trying on your favorite jeans at the end of winter. Like, it's just not going to fit. Come on.
Yeah, yeah.
you know, it's worse than that. It's like walking around in shoes that are too small for you. It's damaging, yeah.
Mm.
So when I was outed and I was asked to resign my membership from the church, it was really incredibly traumatic because my identity was so embedded in that place. It was a large community, and I was the director of music at that church, and it was an important role to me. I had just finished my degree at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, and I was venturing out and becoming a high school music teacher, and it was like all these roads converged all at once, and I guess I was forced into a situation where I I guess I was forced by the actions of others to examine what my identity had been up to that point. In a way that I think we all are in our 20s. We're trying to find the adult versions of ourselves, or at least we were then. I think it happens even earlier now. Uh, but I feel like it was a catalyst for me to start to examine all sorts of things. And, my identity was quite complicated, even so, not just as a lesbian, but also as a Yorta Yorta woman who was yet to connect to that essential part of her being.
Outcast. coming out stories from inspiring LGBTQ+ people today. So let's talk about that. You're a Yorta Yorta woman. You've been open about the fact you're part of the country's stolen generation, even if you didn't always know that. I'm going to talk a bit about the policy for our listeners who might not know, but obviously I can't condense it into 2 sentences actually, but I'm going to force it into 2. Colonial Australia had a policy of forcibly removing indigenous children from their families and placing them with white settler families.
Yeah.
But it was deeply painful. Do you mind telling us a bit about what happened to you, what your story was, or at least what you've been able to piece together?
Well, fortunately, I've been able to piece it all together, Rosie, but that took a long time, can I say? So, as a young child growing up in an all white family and essentially a very white community, there was not a lot of diversity in the 1970s southern suburbs of Sydney, where I grew up. I'd been told by my adopted parents that I was an adopted Aboriginal. That was a title that I always held. And the reason they'd adopted me was because they had been told that my Aboriginal mother had abandoned me in a cardboard box. She'd placed me and in a field. So essentially, left to die, really. When you're old enough to sort of piece that story together, you sort of think, she left me in a cardboard box in a field? Like, what was she thinking? Who would find me in that field?
Mm.
So you start to think, she left me there to die? Is that what they're telling me? That's what they'd been told. And then, as I, progressed through my Bible study lessons at the Baptist church, I realized it wasn't a particularly original story. It kind of sounded a little bit like Moses in the bulrushes. But anyway, I put that aside and I just made up my own reality in my head that my Aboriginal mother must have died. I sort of killed her off in my imagination because I couldn't, I don't think, as a teenager, deal with the idea that my birth mother had abandoned me, even though that's what I was told.
Mm.
And it wasn't until my 20s that I actually learned the truth that I was a member of the stolen generations. And you've got to understand, Rosie, and for listeners who are just coming to understand this brutal policy of basically it's kind of genocide. If you're going to take away the children of one group of society, it's a kind of genocide.
Mm.
You got to understand that for many years in my life, gosh, up until my 30s, the term stolen generation wasn't one that people uh, were familiar with at all. That story was yet to be told. And then when it was told, just like the genocide of the murdered Jews of Europe and the murdered gays and lesbians and others of Europe at the hands of the Nazis, when that story was told, there were people who denied it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, Indigenous Australians have faced down their own Holocaust, and there were Holocaust deniers in this country who denied that the children were taken, who denied the murders and the massacres. Now, certain measures that governments have taken in truth telling over the last 20 years have helped to almost silence those voices, but they'll never be entirely silenced. There are still people that would deny that these things would happen or diminish them in some way, or even worse, blame the victims.
Mm.
When I did finally meet members of my Aboriginal family, I had no capacity to take on the information that I had been taken from my mother. This was something that I was not prepared for. I had no notion that that could even be a thing. I'd grown up being told that I'd been abandoned. I'd accepted that. I'd gone through my own alternate reality and made up story in my teenage years, as I explained, just so I could get through it. And then finally, I actually met my Aboriginal mother, Monica. We had uh, just over 15 years together to get to know one another, to find our way into a relationship before, sadly, she passed away at the age of just 64. But it helped me on my path to actually understand who on earth I am, because
Mm.
without meeting her, without finding out the story of the rest of my family, I I would just be a puzzle that was not assembled properly. Some days I feel like I probably still am. I don't know. You'd have to ask my wife.
Yeah, that's the thing. How does it feel to just, like, not know? Like you were saying, you were telling stories at certain ages to cope with it, I suppose. But yeah, I can't even imagine.
For me, I was with a family, right? So I was with my adopted family from 3 weeks of age. So actually, what had really happened was when my Aboriginal mother, Monica, fell pregnant with me, she was married to the man who is essentially my father, but not in any kind of proactive way. You understand it? No, I think sperm donor is much more accurate.
Fair enough.
But they were in a relationship. He was not an Aboriginal man, and his family were completely against his marriage to an Aboriginal woman, and had expressed this time and time again. But when my mother fell pregnant with me, that was the last straw, and basically they exerted so much pressure on the relationship that he left my mother, Monica, when she was 7 months pregnant with me. Now, this was 1964, and Aboriginal people had virtually no rights, and Aboriginal women, uh, absolutely no rights, no citizenship in Australia, not counted in the census as human beings. We were almost stateless, really. And so Monica, as a single mother, had nothing and nowhere to go. And she had to work. So she entrusted me to the care of um, a woman who'd been formerly had been a officer in the Salvation Army, actually. And whilst my mother, Monica, was at work one day, just as a labourer picking beans, she was doing seasonal work. Whilst she was in the fields picking beans, this former major in the Major Townsend was her name. She gave me to the Cheetham family. And when Monica came home from work that day, where is my baby? She's gone. And I'm not telling you where she's gone because she's much better off than being with you.
Mm.
Now, this was a story of countless Aboriginal mothers, that and worse. Many children were older when they were taken and not sent to families that loved them and cared for them as I had, but sent to orphanages. These are children who had families, siblings, a mother and a father, and they were taken, sent to orphanages like Parramatta Girls' Home or Kinsella Boys' Home, Cootamundra Girls' Home, and basically taught how to be domestic servants, and went into domestic service, unpaid domestic service. Now, in the United States, they called that slavery. In Australia, we just sanitised that and called it domestic service. So things could have been even worse for me, but they couldn't have been worse for my mother, Monica. I was taken from her, and there was no way she could get me back. She had no rights. So that is something that when I discovered the truth of that part of my story, that set me on another journey to make sense of that.
Yeah, it's absolutely traumatic and awful. There's no words for that. What maybe we shouldn't even give it air, but what did Australia claim to be trying to achieve with this policy?
No, that's a great question. And it's an important one. I think that we're doomed to repeat history if we don't understand it. So I don't mind giving it air at all, Rosie. I think it's the right question to ask. What were they trying to do? There was a school of thought that Aboriginal race would die out within a couple of generations. And that if those children of mixed heritage, like myself, a white father, a black mother, if they could be educated out of being Aboriginal, if they could be taken away from their communities, uh, prevented from learning their culture, prevented from learning their language, and given only a Western education, then you would educate those children out of being Aboriginal. And within a couple of generations, there would be no Aboriginal people. Because who wants to deal with the genocide that was enacted upon Aboriginal Australia? Who wants to deal with the reckoning that we're now understanding? Nobody wanted to. They wanted to get away with the notion that it was the lucky country and people had just come here and made good after, their long and difficult journeys, as our recently ousted Prime Minister put it. It was hard for the people who came on the first fleet. It was a long way and a difficult and dangerous journey. Okay, well, who invited you?
Yeah.
Your choice. We're a nation that still is coming to terms with really critical matters that form our nationhood, that are deeply embedded in the psyche of this nation, the things that hold us back, the things that make us view ourselves in terms of only caricature, really, so often.
Hmm.
This comes from what I feel is the missed opportunity right at the beginning of colonisation, if there was ever the opportunity. But right at the beginning of that process, when the British came and decided to stay, there could have been a relationship. There could have been a reciprocal relationship built. But they didn't want that. They wanted to colonise and to own and to dispossess.
Hmm.
And so it'd be much easier if there were no Aboriginal people left to tell that story. So the idea was to educate Aboriginal people out of being Aboriginal.
But it's awful. It's so sinister and
It is sinister, and the British was so, and others, but the British particularly was so practiced at it across the world,
yeah.
and we celebrate it in a sports carnival every few years called the Commonwealth Games, and they're coming back again. I wonder what Australia actually is thinking where it goes, oh, we're part of the Commonwealth. What do you think that means?
Yeah.
The wealth didn't flow to us. It flowed to Great Britain. There are loads of people now who realise that this is a part of our history we don't want to be proud of, and actually, we're viewing with great interest to see how these so-called colonised countries are dealing with their past in the present. How are they dealing with that, and how are they building a kind of future that is going to be based on self-determination and truth? And I think Australia's really struggled with that for a long time.
There is starting to be like a kind of a shift in awareness and a reckoning.
All I can do in my practice as a musician, for many years as a soprano and a performer, and now probably I guess a better chance at having a lasting impact, I hope, as a composer,
Hmm.
is to help people to understand what the truth is, and how to get through it, because I had to navigate that myself. What I'm trying to do, my sort of remit for life, is to help other Australians navigate that course as well.
Yeah.
Uh, it's not just as simple as finding something out, it's about letting go of something you thought was true.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's really true. That would change a lot.
Yeah, and at times in Australia, our leaders have sought to make Australians fearful. We're going to see it right now.
Mm,
We're going to see it the next 6 months or so as we move towards a referendum
yeah, yeah.
about whether there should be a voice to Parliament. And the coalition, the Conservative right wing coalition, the leader of that party has said, we're going to vote no.
Mhm,
Um, And so it begins, for me. This will be the third kind of public opinion poll or referendum that I've lived through that has directly affected my status as a human being in this country in 1967. The referendum to decide whether or not to count Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the census. Prior to that, we were not counted or included, which basically, gave us the status of being not human. Then, of course, the one we all lived through, the postal vote to say whether I could marry my wife.
Mhm.
And now this one, should Aboriginal people be heard in Parliament and determine their own affairs? It's exhausting. It really is. I'm only 58, and this is my third referendum of sorts, so it's quite exhausting to think about it. But it's what we must face. So that's my next 6 months.
It's almost unbelievable. It should be so simple.
I know. I feel like we voted in an election for a government so that they could make decisions that would benefit society.
Mm,
How have they missed the fact that this would be beneficial? I don't know. So they're going to go back to the people and ask them to vote on it, and I'm really disappointed about that.
yeah, it's really disappointing.
I don't know. I feel like my my story in terms of not knowing who I was, that's actually Australia's story.
Mm.
Australia doesn't know who it is, not really properly.
When you got the chance to meet your mother and then you discovered the real story of your background, what sort of age were you? Were you in your 20s or was this before you came out?
I was in my 20s, I was already out. How I got to meet my mother, actually, I was a member of a lesbian theatre group called Witch Theatre, and they operated in the 1980s in Sydney. And I joined Witch Theatre to just, be part of community and get to know people. And in fact, my girlfriend at the time and I were both part of a play called Dykes on Parade. And Dykes on Parade was very successful in Sydney, and so much so that we decided to take it on tour to Canberra. So we went all the way down to Canberra, and we were performing at the Street Theatre in Canberra. And I came out on stage. In the front row, there was a woman who could have been my identical twin. And I tell you, I almost lost my way almost missed my first line because at that time, Rosie, I hadn't seen a whole lot of people that looked like me, let alone someone who looked exactly like me.
Mm.
She had the same reaction. And so at the end of the play, at the end of the evening, we made our way towards each other. This was an entirely lesbian audience. Here's this woman that looks like me. I'm thinking,
Mm.
we've got to be related. I wonder if she's a sister. I wonder well, it turned out she was a cousin. And the reason I knew this was that I had a very famous uncle, and the only piece of information my adopted parents had ever shared with me about my family, apart from my mother, accusing her of abandoning me, they had told me that my uncle was a famous singer. His name was Jimmy Little. Actually, his biography just came out last week, and I wrote the foreword of that book for my cousin, in which I tell a couple of stories. But my uncle was a famous singer, and I guess my adopted parents thought that that was okay because he was famous. You're allowed to know about him, but no one else in your family. So I had this piece of information that Jimmy Little was my uncle. And so when my cousin in Canberra, who had just seen me performing with Witch Theatre, when she asked me, "Who are you? Where are you from?" I had no real answers for her except for the fact that, well, look, I think Jimmy Little is my uncle. She was so taken aback. She said, "I'm your cousin. He's my uncle. I'm your cousin. And your aunt was meant to be here tonight." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Yes, your aunt, your Aboriginal aunt. She's a lesbian, a well-known one in Sydney. Haven't you ever met her?"
Wow.
I'm having this, I'm thinking, oh my God, it's genetic, it's fantastic. Anyway, so she introduced me to my aunt. And my auntie Betty, she's long gone now, sadly, but Auntie Betty was well known in the lesbian scene in the 80s and 90s. She was a political activist as well, incredible, really feisty black woman, someone to be really proud of, but also fear. But when I met Auntie Betty, she just said, "Well, I suppose you want to meet your mother." Suddenly there was a mother that I'd written off, a mother I hadn't thought about, um, you know, and I said, "Yes, of course, yes, I want to meet her." So Auntie Betty arranged for me to meet my mother. But on the day that I was meant to, my girlfriend at the time, Donna and I went over to Auntie Betty's place, and it was awful actually. It'd been one of those Sydney weekends where it had rained and rained and rained. And we got to Auntie Betty's place, and the rain was still pelting down. She opened the door and she said, "Look, your mother's been in a car accident last night. She's in a pretty bad way, but we're going to go to the hospital." So, first time I met my Aboriginal mother was in the hospital. She wasn't on life support. She was conscious, but she had tubes and cuts and abrasions. She's been in a terrible car accident. Her car was T-boned in an intersection. And, she escaped with her life, but only narrowly. So I almost didn't meet her at all. But the first time I met her, I I took my girlfriend. I just thought, well, my aunt is a lesbian. I'm a lesbian. I'm sure that my mother, even though I'm meeting her for the first time, will be fine with me being a lesbian. Well, it turned out she wasn't.
Mm.
It was something she struggled with. It was something she struggled with, which was ironic because in the end, my Baptist adopted mother accepted my sexuality. But when I came out to her that I'd met my Aboriginal family, she disowned me. So I had one mother who just couldn't accept that I was Aboriginal, the other one that struggled with the fact I was a lesbian. And I thought, you two need to get together and sort this out. They
Yeah.
never did. They never did. But I think my mum was worried. She'd seen what her sister had gone through,
Yeah.
and she was worried that it was going to make my life a whole lot harder. And sure, there were challenges, but not so many as there would have been if I'd had to live a life where I was pretending to be a heterosexual woman.
Yeah, exactly. It wouldn't be better.
No, it wouldn't be better. Unthinkable, really, for me.
Yeah.
I knew from a very early age that I was not interested in the opposite sex. If I'd relented as a Baptist or at any point along the journey where it was just put to me as, the only option, if I'd ever accepted that, I think I would have been a much lesser human being for that.
Mm.
My biological mother, she struggled with accepting that. She never really came to terms with it. She didn't exclude me in any way because of it, but I know she struggled with it, and that was a sad thing. We had enough distance between us simply because of what I'd grown up thinking and how late in life I met her. And so there was enough for us to struggle through. We didn't need that as well, but that's how it was. And what could I do? There was nothing I could do about that.
Did she accept her sister? Was she close with her sister or?
She did, but Auntie Betty belonged to another generation that weren't. She was a political activist. Yeah, she was a feminist, but I don't think that she was. She wasn't closeted, but she wasn't as out. I think as public as I was.
Mm.
I think that my mother, like any mother, worries for their child that they're making life harder for themselves. I think she thought that.
Yeah.
No, but she loved her sister.
Yeah. And she probably thought, she would love and be proud of her sister, but she might not necessarily want her child to be an activist and to have a difficult life like that.
Yeah, true. I think that that's what it was. Our parents do the best that they can, right? I really do believe that. I do believe that parents do the best that they can, and if that falls short, and often it does, of expectations, then it cannot remain a barrier to your life. You have to find your way past that,
Mm.
and accept the shortcomings of your parents in the same way that you expect them to accept your own shortcomings. And it hardly ever does it work out that way, which is why in traditional societies, in indigenous societies, children are not raised by their mother and their father. They're raised by uncles and aunties. That one step removed
Mm.
is for preservation of lots of things, but it's a time honoured method of raising children in traditional societies, and I think one that's really worth further examination in today's society, because I think parents do struggle on their own, and there are a lot of single parents, mothers and fathers, who, how do they do it? It is such a struggle to navigate all of life's admin and then to do that for young human beings as well. It's really tough. So having a community around you and having your uncles, your aunties as your the people who do most of the raising of the children is there's a lot of sense in that, but I know not everybody has that option.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me actually, yeah. And it makes so much sense because when you're really close to a thing, you can't see the wood for the trees.
No, you can't. That's exactly right. It's interesting, in later life when I did get to know all of my Aboriginal family, there were cousins who were raised by Monica. So the children of Auntie Betty, for instance, were raised by my mother. 6 of Monica's 9 children were taken from her. So it's heartening to me that she was able to raise my aunt's children, and those children saw her as a mother, and they benefited not only from being raised by Monica, but it actually helped their relationship with their own parents. It's meant everything to me to piece together who my family is and where I fit into that and how I belong. And I'm forever grateful for that night in Canberra when my cousin was in the audience and I was able to make that first connection.
Yeah, and I love that you were performing when that kinda happened and it all intersects, and it makes a nice segue to talking about music and your music career, which I can't wait to do. I work in music as well, and I just wanna hear all about it. So, how does your creative world, classical music and opera, sort of tell the story of First Nations people or not tell that story? Is there a way of sort of segueing what you're learning about First Nations with how you're making performance art and theatre and music around this time of your life?
It makes perfect sense that opera should be my great love.
Mm.
What is opera? It's ceremony. It's the coming together of all of the art forms. And that is what ceremony is for Indigenous people, coming together of song, dance, visual art,
Mm.
narrative. All of those things are completely familiar in the Indigenous space for millennia. And that's what opera is. The very first time I experienced opera, it was 1979, and my high school music teacher, who's still a very dear friend to this day, Jennifer King, took me along to see my first opera, Sydney Opera House. I was there today, actually. I've written a ballet on commission from the Australian Ballet, and it's premiering on the 2nd of May in the Joan Sutherland Theatre. But, when I went along to see my very first opera, I fell in love with it. And I think it makes absolute and complete sense that music being so essential to Indigenous society and opera being so like ceremony that Indigenous people have known for millennia, it just makes complete sense to me. And the fact that I perform or have throughout my early career performed almost exclusively from the Western canon, so what? I also drive a car. It doesn't make me any less Indigenous, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So, I don't walk everywhere.
yeah.
I'm not wearing a possum skin cloak tonight. It's just like I'm a 21st century Aboriginal woman. So whatever is available to me,
Mm.
I experience the world, but I see it through an Indigenous lens. I don't have any other choice, and I wouldn't want it any other way. Western classical music, my own composition, ABBA. Who cares? If it's storytelling and it's music, and if it's worth hearing more than once, then I'm there. You know, Quite often, Aboriginal people are herded onto these cultural missions. We were herded onto missions when our land was taken from us, but in the 20th century, I saw artists and musicians and dancers being herded onto what I call cultural missions, that you will only paint in traditional way, you will only sing in traditional way, you'll only dance in traditional way. And why should that be so? Aboriginal culture was always contemporary. It was always evolving to meet the changes in environment and landscape. So whether it's classical music, whether it's traditional songlines, I'd love to know the traditional songlines of the Yorta Yorta and the Yuin people, but many of those songs were beaten out of people early on
Mhm.
in the process of colonisation, and unearthing them is a really difficult task. So what I do is I say, well, the songline is continuing through me, and it sounds different today, but it always sounded different. As the world changed, the songs would have adapted. Otherwise, the people wouldn't have survived.
Yeah, similarly, I saw or I read somewhere that your One Day in January project, it kinda intersected with meeting Chichi Nwanaku over in the UK. I can't remember where you said you'd met her, but
Yeah,
yeah, because I used to work at Classic FM over in London, and when I worked there, Chichi got her own show, and Chineke was really
yeah.
becoming the incredible successful project it was, ethnically diverse musicians making up this entire orchestra completely against I don't know how to put this, I'm gonna put it in a cynical way, the odds, and I'm using, air quotes. Obviously, Chichi was told that you won't be able to form an orchestra full of Black and ethnically diverse musicians because they just simply don't play classical music.
No, you're absolutely right.
And what Gypsy's found, and I think what I'd love to hear from you, but what you found speaking with her is that you share that same, belief that, first of all, that's absolute codswallop, and you can make ensembles of ethnically diverse and Black musicians, Aboriginal musicians playing this music if that's what they so want to do and want to train in.
Absolutely. You just need to marry, ability with opportunity.
Mm,
It wasn't for lack of ability, it was for lack of opportunity.
mhm,
And the weight of low expectation that was the burden of Black and ethnically diverse people in the UK and Aboriginal people here.
mm,
When I met Chichi Nwanaku, I felt like I was meeting my twin again. We were talking about the same things in the same language, and what I'd done in opera for singers, she was doing for instrumentalists at the same time in the UK. The conversation I had with her was the catalyst for and the inspiration for forming a project that would help to develop an Indigenous ensemble here in Australia. And we have that ensemble now, Ensemble Dutala. What's different about Ensemble Dutala is that in its first iteration, so we're still in the first 4 years of that, we're going into the fourth year now, I've focused entirely on First Nations musicians. Now, this is different for Chi Chi. She's drawing on Black and ethnically diverse from a range of nations and a much larger population as well.
yeah, yeah.
Dutal is a Yorta Yorta word, which means star-filled sky.
Mm,
So that's the name that I gave to the ensemble as an aspirational title that would say, look, we're going to fill the sky with these points of light that are the musicians. I've focused entirely the efforts at this point on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander musicians in terms of marrying ability with opportunity. So, scholarships that we're providing through Short Black Opera into the One Day in January project. There are a lot of titles there. So, Short Black Opera is the company, which of course I formed back in 2009 to help singers to find their Indigenous singers to find a pathway to a career in classical music. And now that company is producing the project One Day in January that brings together Indigenous orchestral musicians. And those who are of a sufficient standard make it into the Ensemble Dutala. We also have a junior Ensemble Dutala program, which is really cute. But what I wanted to do, first of all, was give the opportunity to Indigenous musicians. We always augment that ensemble dutala with friends, and I'm very fortunate to be the First Nations chair of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. So they're a partner in this project, and they provide players to augment our ranks when we need that. But I am thinking also, and I've been talking about this with my board and with Aaron Wyatt, who's the musical director of Ensemble Dutala and who runs the One Day in January program for me. that I'd like to look at the Chinake model again and perhaps extend Ensemble du Tala to First Nations people from other places
Mm.
so that this can be a broader program. And that's not just to get more numbers, but it is to recognize that we have a lot in common in our lived experience and to celebrate that and to see what kind of an ensemble that produces. But all the scholarships through the One Day in January project, they all go to First Nations young musicians. But it was definitely that initial conversation with Chi Chi that made me think this has to happen now. That and the fact that as a composer, I'd been writing for a lot of ensembles in Australia, most of the state orchestras, many of the most celebrated ensembles in Australia, and never once had I written for an Indigenous musician in any of those ensembles. And I thought, well,
Mm.
who's going to do something about that if I don't?
Yeah, it's a really good point. Yeah, I wonder if is there even a figure of how many members of the kind of the state and the kind of renowned orchestras in Australia are Indigenous?
Well, actually, I'm in the middle of a research project at the moment, funded by the Loacha Institute, and it is precisely to find out how many there are. Well, I can tell you none.
Yeah.
And secondly, how many have there been historically? One. And he was on the casuals list of West Australian Symphony Orchestra for 10 years, but he was never on contract. And we're all about changing that. But as is the case in a lot of things in Australia right at the moment, with people waking up to the reality of the true value of Aboriginal culture, of Indigenous culture, First Nation cultures, and seeing them as an asset rather than a liability for the first time in 230 years, what we're finding is demand is outstripping supply.
Yeah.
It seems like only yesterday, in one sense, that I started this new position at the conservatorium. It was great. It's great to go back to my alma mater, Sydney Conservatorium of Music. You know, it's such a great institution. Um, it has such a long and illustrious history in this country, and to go back there as the Elizabeth Todd Chair of Vocal Studies is a great honour. And in a sense, it feels like it only started yesterday. In another way, it seems like I've been there for years because uh, it's a place where I know I'm going to make the next important contribution to shaping how all musicians think and how they view themselves as living and learning on on these unceded lands. And it's interesting. A lot of people have talked to me about, oh, are you going to teach Indigenous music? And I'm thinking, no. I mean, for starters, I'm a chair, so I'm doing a lot of things that are different. It's not only about that, although it could be about that, but it's not about that. It's actually about bringing an Indigenous lens and sharing that with all students so that they can have an understanding of the lands that they live on. I think I want to use this position to actually elevate music, or to not just elevate it, but to return it to its essential place in society. And that is as a way of knowing and being. Mm.
And that was going to be one of my questions, what your kind of mission with this new appointment is, if you have a kind of vision. But I feel like you've just given us a really good insight into that.
Yeah, I think it is to help each of the students that I have, where I have any influence, is to help them understand the essential nature of being a musician, and that there's a tradition of that on this continent
Mm.
that they can become aware of, get to know and understand and become part of.
Yeah, much more conscious music maker and kind of more conscious human, I suppose, at the end of it.
Certainly that. But especially after a period of time where, in Australia at least, musicians and those in the arts generally were made to feel less than throughout the pandemic years, as we were.
Mm.
You know, these students that I'm interacting with now, they are the students who missed out on their final 2 years of school.
Yeah, yeah.
They are the students who were practicing away at their instrument over Zoom lessons. So this is a really particular time to nurture and restore. a sense of self for those musicians. And I think I can bring a sensibility that, comes with my indigeneity to that. But also, I've had a long career in classical music, so I want to help them find their way into careers that will have longevity as mine has.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Coming out stories from inspiring LGBTQ plus people today. I like asking my guests, although I think as I go on, I don't know how I feel about this question, but I do like asking my guests what gives them hope. I don't know how I feel about the cliche of the question just tonight.
I don't think it's cliched at all. It may be cliched for me to give this answer, but music gives me hope.
Mm.
Music gives me hope. When I see the way that it can light up someone's life, it can shed light on the darkest night. Music can shine and illuminate the beauty of the world in a way that no other art form can. Music and its power to change a way of thinking to something more positive, or to bring the truth into someone's thinking. Yeah, music, but even more particularly live performance.
Yeah.
To see human endeavor come together. You can have the most disparate group of people. They could be bickering backstage, and they often are. And then they can come together on stage or in the pit or in the recital hall, and music can bring out the truth and the beauty that is within us all, that we're all capable of, but sometimes we lose sight of. Music gives me hope.
Yeah, it's so true. So beautiful.
Mm.
What does it like distills everything into truth, perhaps?
I wish I'd said that. Let's pretend I did. No, I love that you said that, and I quote you on that. It does. Music does. It will transmit a truth. It will bypass the analytical, and it will actually enter straight into the soul.
Mm, mm.
It does. It distills the truth.
And thinking about this, I mean, we just all celebrated World Pride in Sydney a month ago, and I watched you at the opening celebration. It kind of encapsulates that. Why was there so much music at World Pride? Because obviously, music's the best.
It is. Music's a way of knowing, and more than knowing, the greater journey in life, which is understanding. Music is the passage to understanding. And yeah, it was a really exciting time, World Pride. I've been away from Sydney for a long time. I lived in Melbourne for 16 years, and Melbourne's a great town, and it's been very meaningful to me in the formation of Short Black Opera. But coming home to Sydney to live now, and at that time to celebrate World Pride, it just reminded me of all of the work of all of the 78ers,
Mm,
who lived through that protest. It should have been a celebration. It became a protest, and it became one that we've built upon, and it's so important to recognize that and to celebrate it. And I was just really proud to be part of World Pride, and to, also then perform with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra and have them perform my work as part of the Black and Deadly Gala, and have my wife conduct that. It was really special for us, and it was a great time, and it reminded me just how great a town Sydney can be.
yeah, it can
Mm,
sometimes.
it can sometimes.
Oh, well, thanks so much. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
No worries at all. I'm so glad you were able to be patient enough until we could actually get a time. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Outcast, a podcast with interviews and coming out stories from inspiring LGBTQ plus people. You can follow us on social media at OutcastLGBT, and you can find us online at outcastpod.com. Thank you for listening.